moving on to our first speaker, we have Benjamin Speyer, the CEO of Serica. Unfortunately, Duke Wang, our managing partner, had some technical difficulties that we have not been able to remedy. So replacing him instead is our CEO, who will provide some insight into the modes of entry available for companies joining the Chinese market. Benjamin?
Thank you, Matt. Okay, hello everyone. It's a great pleasure to speak with you once again at this summit. I'm a little under the weather today, so please excuse my raspy voice and any potential coughing outbursts that may occur throughout it. Cool, so my colleague Duke, like me, he's a specialist in cross-border transactions. Feel free to read his bio in more detail when this deck and recording are shared in the future. So today we'll be covering different modes of entry. We'll examine and compare each one and hopefully try to give you some practical advice and tips along the way. So before we get into that, let's have a quick look at some of the sort of key commercial challenges, some of which you should or perhaps are not aware of. So the first is language barrier and cultural differences. Now, this is, of course, something that everyone's aware of, but nevertheless remains a huge ongoing challenge for new entrants and veterans alike. A less well-known challenge for new entrants is actually the high cost of doing business in China. And while not as expensive as regions like London, New York, or the Bay Area, it is not the sort of cheap haven that many of you would believe. The next, one of the most underestimated of challenges, and in our view, something considerably more challenging than protecting your IP, is recruiting and retaining local talent. I'd encourage all of you to see Leo from Hayes, excellent presentation yesterday to learn more about that. And then lastly, our insulated ecosystems. So these are largely unknown, even to many market veterans. So, put simply, China has many ecosystems. They're seemingly unconnected, but in fact highly integrated, and they exist across the country. Serica, we call them ecosystem clusters, and they're essential to understand and integrate to be successful here. So let's kind of briefly elaborate on what we mean by ecosystems. So as you can see, this is the ecosystem of the West. So you can see it has a hierarchical structure. There's clear separations between the core business and the other areas. It's limited communication between different levels, and core business takes a very sort of passive, reactive role in relation. So put simply, the system is rigid, linear, and static in nature. China, however, is a completely different story. Stakeholder roles mix and overlap with fluid communication across all levels. Core business takes a proactive role in shaping and growing the ecosystem directly. So it's agile, it's flexible, and it's fluid in nature. But what does that look like in real life? So on the left, you can see an ecosystem cluster from Alibaba. This is not their entire ecosystem because it's so big, but just that's what we could fit into a single slide. So what does an ecosystem offer? What are the benefits? So members can get vast and rapid access to a whole variety of solutions. They can share intel and resources to boost efficiency and execution. They can repel competitors trying to disrupt from the outside, and they can safeguard against foul play. This is how business gets done in China. And something that a lot of new entrants aren't aware of, a very common occurrence is, a company enters the market for the first time. They have a really high quality solution available, but they often find that even if they sell at a loss, they're getting beaten to the punch by local companies which have, often inferior products and sometimes at higher prices. And that leaves them understandably perplexed because they're not aware of this. So as we go into the different modes of entry together, I'd encourage you all to keep the importance of integrating yourself into these ecosystems at the front of your mind. So starting with greenfield. This usually takes the form of a woofie in a tier 1 city like Shanghai, Beijing, Hangzhou, or Shenzhen, and is a common form of entry for companies of all shapes and sizes. So you can see the process here is far from straightforward, but we really wanted to hire some of the upfront costs that you might have. So based on the Hayes salary guide, mid-tier pricing averages for different corporate service companies, you'll see that the total cost of setting up an operation is equivalent to about $375,000 US, and that's before rent, marketing, and other operational costs. So the bottom line, while you stand to benefit from really highly lucrative returns in the long term, the upfront costs, high risks, operational complexity, make this only for companies with deep pockets, really extensive capabilities, and frankly, a very long-term vision and patience to go along with it. So we would avoid this option for any company that hasn't raised at least a C round in investment. So in terms of our advice, localize, focus on finding a product market fit first, perhaps over huge complex deals that give you the trust that you need to kind of snowball, prioritize recruitment early on, and really manage your own expectations. Ultimately, there's no silver bullet for China. And in the beginning, as everyone here will attest to, everything takes much longer and costs considerably more than you might expect. So plan accordingly. Tech licensing is next. This is a pretty swift and low resource intensive method to establish new revenue streams. This is what the process looks like in its most basic form. You can study it later, and we won't cover this today, as most of the process you'll outsource to external advisors and legal counsel. So the bottom line here, it's somewhat fast and low cost. You can realize revenue pretty quickly and kind of keep all of your focus on your innovations and on the domestic market. At best, the revenue potential is often quite limited and may deteriorate over time. At worst, if it's done badly, it can cause huge damage to you from the associated risks. Tech licensing is for everyone, provided that they have compelling IP. So regardless of your size, this is a viable option for you. For our advice, as Alex from Linklaters and Rosie from Control Risk said yesterday, really ensure your IP is protected and do your homework on any prospective targets. For me, I'd say just be really patient and diligent with your deal structure. Don't just leave it to outside advisors and lawyers. Really collaborate heavily with them throughout the process, so you can ensure that your interests are protected in both the short and the long term. If the deal has some different risk vectors, for example, you're doing one with an SOE, then we always say the best way to safeguard your interest is to continue to innovate and find ways to add value, stay relevant, stay interested, and things will move well quite nicely. Moving on to M&A, or more specifically, buy-side acquisitions. Now, this is an option typically reserved for ambitious unicorns and established multinationals, but considering the bulk of our audience are scale-ups and SMEs, and some of the time constraints that we have, we've opted to skip this option. For any multinationals that are listening, we will have a focused webinar on this topic in early May, sector agnostic, so please keep an eye out for that. So moving on to joint ventures. A relatively quick and cost-effective way for companies to enter the market with local support and confidence. In terms of process, I'm not going to give you a seminar on joint venture best practice. I prefer to instead focus on sort of the bottom line and some additional time on some of the advice that we give you for something that's very broadly applicable to everyone watching today. So what are the sort of bottom lines here? Joint ventures do offer a relatively low risk, low cost, and swift way to enter the market effectively. Generally, the typical basic model of cooperation in most cross-border JVs typically involves the innovator focusing on delivering the solutions, while the local partner handles the government and the business development. Given the various challenges for China, this is traditionally one of the most popular and effective ways to enter the market, except for early stage startups with untested solutions. But it's not all sunshine and rainbows. It can be a pretty highly challenging to source, negotiate the right deal structure. But I think the largest challenge is in post-deal integration, which is the #1 cause of failure in most cross-border joint ventures. So companies really have to invest considerable time and resources into it throughout the life cycle. And for those of you that were here on day one, that's something that Jed spoke about on his experience with his joint venture. So what advice can we offer? Really take time to invest time into mapping out the ecosystem you wish to penetrate. Take nothing for granted and conduct due diligence at every opportunity throughout the process. When engaging, focus on building trust and alignment over the business scope, JV goals, business model before you get bunkered down in specific deal terms. I really can't emphasize this point enough. It's a really, really common mistake that we see all of the time. Nearly always causes either the deal to fall through in the 11th hour, or it results in post-deal integration issues that completely sort of derail the venture and that ultimately fails to deliver. So really, really take that on board. In terms of integration, take the time to involve the C-suite throughout the life cycle of the project. If you aren't able to do that, you are probably going to set yourself up for failure and upset. And lastly, use non-executive directors and reputable lawyers to mitigate against potential conflicts or deadlocks. Really help use them to keep your venture on track. So to summarize, greenfield, while it does offer lucrative long-term rewards, it is expensive, it is quite high risk, it is operationally complex. So only do it if you really have the capital and the resources and time to invest into it. In contrast, tech licensing, it's fast and low intensive to execute, but usually has limitations on revenue. If it's done poorly, it can present a series of dangerous risks. For acquisitions, it's high risk, it's high cost, but done well, they do deliver, immediate market access, revenue generation, and innovation development opportunities. But as I mentioned before, this is just an option for ambitious unicorns and established multinationals. Lastly, joint ventures, relatively low cost, low risk, and swift way to penetrate the market that the majority of companies can do, but it's got to be planned and executed very well. And post-deal requires considerable resources to keep the venture on track, so keep that in mind. Bottom line, you can be successful in China through these methods. I think a constant throughout this summit from all speakers that I'll echo again is take the time to understand the market, localize your approach, leverage local partnerships, and just remember in China, it's the market where anything is possible, but nothing is easy. So best of luck to everyone on their journey. And once again, a small reminder, our China healthcare report will be released in April. If you want first access to that, please follow Serica on our official LinkedIn account. Thanks very much. Back to you, Matt.
Lovely. Thanks, Ben. Really great stuff. I think quite interesting and innovating. I think time for just one quick question. For companies that enter the market and find that they've entered with the wrong mode, can you switch? What kind of opportunity costs are associated with that?
It's a great question. Obviously, it would depend on which mode of entry. If you've sunk, close to $1 million into a greenfield operation, and your runway's looking a little tight, it might be time to exit completely, wait a couple of years, and then come back when you're stronger. But in terms of maybe a JV or an acquisition that didn't go quite to plan, I think really having a sort of autopsy of looking at like why that happened, and particularly examining the early stages of the decision-making process and what led you to take the actions that you took, you can really learn a lot of lessons for that. You know, China isn't easy, and you know, if at first you don't succeed, try again, you know, within reason. So next time round, have a better strategy, utilize better sort of local partners, you know, and I'm sure, you know, you've got a good chance of being successful. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, hope so too. And nice to know that, you know, first blushes aren't always what's going to define your success here. So great stuff.
Yeah,
Really
it certainly,
appreciate
it certainly wasn't for Serica, that's for sure. It took a long time.
it. Yeah, sure was. Great. Well, thanks, Ben.